All right, welcome everybody. So I thought I'd start this tutorial series for those interested in software development. I found that sometimes I don't really like the way others go about doing tutorials for software development. So I thought I'd throw my hat in the ring and see if anybody else reacted well to how I want to go about doing this. So my initial thought is that I'm going to make a recipe storage app with full user authentication, storage with MongoDB. So my thoughts for the tech stack I'm going to use React, React GraphQL, HTML, CSS for the front end, of course. Maybe I'll throw in Sass or something like that. But I tend to find that when people start trying to make things look pretty, it can often get in the weeds a little bit and be difficult for those not versed in certain CSS principles to follow. So I'm going to try to stick to as simple styling as I can, and then hopefully that increases understanding a bit more. For the backend, I'm going to use Node, Apollo GraphQL, Auth0, and MongoDB. So Auth0 is going to be what I use for user auth, MongoDB for the database, GraphQL for Apollo GraphQL for the server, and how I retrieve information from the database. So that's my initial stack. Could change over time, but I think it's likely that it will stick close to that for most of the series, if not all of it. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And bear with me because this is my first time doing any kind of tutorial or anything like that. So bear with me because there may be some sticky points or things I don't quite do correctly. So yeah, so I hope you enjoy. I hope you you gain something from it, something useful, and I hope it helps you in learning to work with some of these tools and get better at software development. So yeah, I hope you enjoy the series. All right, so this first episode is mainly going to be covering the initial boilerplate setup. So we're going to be creating our React app, and then creating our initial server and creating our GraphQL endpoint. So it's going to be pretty short and to the point, but it'll get you everything you needed to get your initial client and server setup going. So we're going to go to my desktop where I've created a folder for YouTube, and I'm gonna make a new project. We're gonna call this recipe tutorial. All right, so we're gonna go in there. We're going to create a client folder and a server folder. So now in the client folder, we're going to set up our initial React app. So we're going to do yarn create Vite. Vite is just another way to create a React app. So it's similar to create React app, but it has kind of a nicer setup in terms of how you get the boilerplate going. So now we have our React app created. So we're going to open this in VS Code. We're going to minimize this for now. All right, so you can see our client and server directories. Server doesn't have anything in it right now, so let's just go into the client. All right, now you can see our initial app component is all set up already with Vite, and I apologize for the slowness of my current computer. It's an old MacBook Air, so I'll have to upgrade at some point soon. Anyway, to get this started, we will bring up the terminal. We're going to go into the client, and we're going to run yarn dev, which is going to start our development server so we can see the progress we're making on our React app. Uh-oh. All right, so of course I forgot to run yarn to install all the dependencies. Classic Classic problem, if you don't install the dependencies, it won't run. So make sure you do that. All right, now that we have our dependencies installed, we can run yarn dev, which is going to start our development server. And I'll bring that up here in a second. All right, let's bring this down to size a little bit so we can actually see what we're working on. All right, so there we go. Now we have our initial React app running. As you can see, it is reactive and running. All right, now that we have our React app running, we're gonna take a break from the front end and go to the back end. So let's go into our server directory, and we're going to initialize a new yarn project with yarn init-y. The yes flag essentially just makes it so you don't have to fill out any of the questions they ask you. Now, before we get started with any code, we're going to need to install some dependencies, of course. So we're going to install NodeMon, Apollo Server, and GraphQL for now. We will add more like MongoDB and Mongoose as we need them, but this is what we're going to start out with. Okay, now that we have our dependencies installed, I'm going to make a few modifications to this package.json. So we're going to set the type to be module, so we can use ES6 imports, and then we're going to create some scripts. So scripts are basically just commands you can run to do things with your project. So we're going to set our start to be node index.js. So when you run node and then a file, it's going to run that file through the JavaScript engine. And then we're also going to do dev, which is going to be nodemon index.js. So nodemon is essentially stands for node monitor. So it's going to monitor our index file, and if we make any changes to it, it's going to update immediately. It's going to refresh it without us having to manually shut it down and restart it every time we make changes, which saves a lot of time and makes things a lot easier to work with and less frustrating. So now we're going to create our index file for our server. We're not going to add anything to it yet. All right, now we're going to create some of the initial boilerplate we're going to need for Apollo Server and GraphQL. So I'm going to create two files. They're going to be resolvers.js, and I'm also going to create typedefs.js. So typedefs, it's essentially the type definition for the schemas you're going to use in GraphQL. So you know, your queries, your mutations, whatever you want to do, you need to have it typed, because although we're only using JavaScript and not TypeScript, GraphQL requires you to type things correctly. So we are going to define, actually we're going to do export a new variable typedefs, and we're going to make it be a template string. And then we're going to define it to be a GraphQL string. So now the IDE recognizes that as GraphQL, and it's going to do the correct colorizing of various keywords. So we're going to create one query to start out with, or our query schema. We're going to have a simple query hello, and we're going to expect it to return a type string. I'm just doing the most basic kind of query I can just to show you how it all gets set up. So let's save this, remove some of this extra white space. We'll clean it up later. Now we head over to the resolvers. So the resolvers are essentially the functions that work to resolve specific queries. So you can get them really complex, but we're going to start out really simple with just a simple resolver for our hello query. So we're going to create our resolvers variable. It's going to be an object. Within the object, we're going to have a key query, which is going to correspond to the query we defined earlier in the typedefs. That's going to be an object. It's going to have hello, which is going to have a resolver function that returns a string hello world. Classic example, very simple, just as we defined in the type def section. All right, now we're ready to set up the initial Apollo server. So we're going to need to import Apollo server from Apollo server and import start standalone server from Apollo server / standalone. We're also going to need to import typedefs from typedefs.js and import resolvers from resolvers.js. All right, now that we have our imports set up, we're going to define a new Apollo server. And the way you do that is you have to pass in your typedefs and your resolvers, and that is essentially all that is required to set up an Apollo server. So Apollo server comes with a function start standalone server, which essentially creates an Express app that uses our Apollo server as middleware. So we're going to do that next. So we're going to have the URL equals await start standalone server, and we need to pass in our server, our Apollo server we just created, and then we're going to have it listen, passing in our port that we want to have it listen on, and we're going to choose 4000 as classic port. You can choose any open port, but I'm using 4000 here. And then we're going to have it log template string server ready at URL. So now if we go in our package.json, you can see we have our dev command. So we're going to run yarn dev, which should start our server correctly. Oops. Okay, looks like I forgot to export this. So we're going to export const resolvers, and that should be working now. Oops, I also forgot to import, and I didn't import correctly. So resolvers. Bear with me. This is the kind of stuff that happens as in the normal development process. So you can get a nice look into what debugging looks like. All right, so now that we have our initial server ready at localhost 4000, I'm going to go to localhost 4000. And I'm going to expand this page so you'll be able to see it a little bit better. All right, so the Apollo sandbox, or GraphQL sandbox, it's essentially a nice visual way to see kind of what you're working on. Great way to debug your queries or mutations if you're having an issue. You can add variables and things and run exactly what you need to test out what you've created. So I'll show just an example query. It already has populated the fields with our hello query that we already created in the resolvers and typedefs. Clearly, it expects a string, so we're going to expect the string hello world when we run the query. So we have the initial operation here. We're going to run the example query. It's requesting hello, and then let's see what happens when we run it. All right, so it's returned a payload data with the query hello, and then the response we expected, hello world. So that'll wrap it up for the first episode. We just created our initial boilerplate for the server and the client, and in the next episode we're going to get a little bit more into the weeds of building our both our front end and our server. So stay tuned if you want to see more. And if you're enjoying the series, please like, subscribe, and comment. And I'll see you guys in the next one. All right.